What I want to say is this, a reality that, in my view, has become increasingly clear, namely, that the United States no longer really has the capacity to keep fighting Iran. What we are seeing right now is a constant stream of talk about so-called peace agreement negotiations making progress. Maybe talks are happening, maybe they are not, and even if they are, outside observers do not really know what is being discussed. But in my view, the truly crucial point is not the text of any agreement. It is something else entirely. The United States can now only assume the posture of negotiating for peace because it can no longer afford the cost of continuing the war. And when I say it can no longer afford it, I do not mean financially. I mean something more direct and more concrete. It no longer has the material basis required to continue fighting Iran. In the past, people often said that in the end, war is decided by logistics, by whether the front lines can keep being fed. That logic has not changed today, only the form has changed. Modern war is no longer just about food and fuel. It is about who can keep replenishing missiles, radars, platforms, and the entire system of wartime consumption. And on that front, the United States is clearly in very bad shape. One could even say that it has lost so badly that it may no longer be capable of reopening the war against Iran. That is also why it appears so passive and so urgent in these so-called peace negotiations. What we need to discuss is actual capability, not verbal narratives. Of course, the US government can go on claiming that it has won, and the White House can keep putting out different versions of the story, saying that negotiations are based on some principle outsiders cannot see. But none of that changes one basic fact. This war has exposed the true state of US military capability. When propaganda collides with reality, reality eventually strikes back, and that is exactly what the United States is now facing. Over the past few weeks, the scale of US ammunition expenditure has been staggering. Hundreds, possibly even thousands, of Tomahawk cruise missiles have reportedly been fired, rapidly draining stockpiles. At the same time, missiles used to intercept incoming fire or conduct standoff strikes have also been consumed in very large numbers. We know that supplies of these weapons are also extremely tight. In a certain sense, this may be exactly why, in the later phase of the conflict, the battlefield situation shifted in a direction less favorable to US forces, even to the point of aircraft being shot down. From every angle, these developments point to the same issue. Missile reserves are suffering from severe shortages, and that shortage is crippling the operational capacity of the US military. Worse still, the problem is not simply that the US is consuming these weapons quickly, it is that it replenishes them very slowly. The United States produces only about 100 Tomahawk missiles per year. In other words, if it has burned through several hundred in just a few weeks, it has effectively spent 8 or 10 years of future production in advance. There is no way to refill that gap in a matter of months, even several years would not be enough. What is really choking the US military now is no longer resolve, but time. So the United States is now facing a brutally stark choice. Either continue depleting stockpiles to dangerous levels and lose the ability to launch new operations for a long time to come, or stop immediately and halt further expenditure of these weapons. Put simply, the choice is between forcing things now or preserving the ability to survive later. In this situation, the US military no longer has any genuinely good options. This war with Iran has directly exposed its strategic weakness and exposed it thoroughly, and this is not just about one particular missile. Nearly all the munitions the United States is using follow the same logic: high consumption, low replenishment, insufficient stockpile depth, and broad systemic shortages coming to the surface. What is being exposed is not a single-point failure, but a structural problem in the entire military-industrial system. Behind this lies a deeper problem in the American industrial model itself. Its industrial system has been profoundly shaped by neoliberal logic, an obsession with just-in-time delivery, zero inventory, and so-called maximum efficiency. The problem is that these ideas may improve profits in a commercial environment, but once applied under wartime conditions, they become a disaster. Such a system has no built-in redundancy, no buffer, and no ability to surge production quickly. It is not designed for resilience, it is designed for cost minimization and profit maximization. There is no spare capacity in the system, not enough reserve labor, and no capital invested in advance to support wartime expansion. So once a war enters a phase of high consumption, the system cannot keep up. And the problem is not just that there are too few production lines. Many US missile systems themselves depend on extremely complex global supply chains. A large share of components are not manufactured domestically, and raw materials are also highly dependent on external sources. Once the conflict escalated, risks in the Strait of Hormuz, volatility in logistics chains, and shortages of key materials could all be transmitted rapidly into the military-industrial system. Even a basic material like aluminum can become a bottleneck. Once one point gets stuck, the entire chain slows down. That is why delivery timelines are measured not in weeks or months, but in years. This is not a short-term imbalance, it is a structural lag. In other words, the US military has no rapid pathway to restore combat power. and the US
government has therefore been forced by reality to narrow its choices.
And it must be emphasized that this crisis is not limited to weapons stockpiles. Other critical systems are also under severe strain. At least several sophisticated radar systems in the Middle East have reportedly been destroyed, and each one is said to require an astonishingly long replacement timeline, possibly years. At the same time, platforms that were already aging, such as B-52 bombers and aerial refueling tankers, have also been put under enormous stress in this conflict. They were already serving beyond their intended lifespan, and continued high-intensity use will only accelerate their deterioration. More troubling still, some of these capabilities, once lost, may not be fully recoverable, because the relevant industrial facilities, machine tool capacities, and maintenance ecosystems no longer exist. This means the US military is facing not merely a temporary setback, but a real risk of lasting capability shrinkage. At bottom, this is the consequence of neoliberal logic applied to the military system. It places efficiency above resilience and manages the armed forces as though they were corporations governed by cost control principles. Low inventories, low redundancy, low flexibility, with constant emphasis on streamlining and savings. But war has never worked that way. Wartime demands surplus, reserves, and production capacity that can scale rapidly under pressure, not a supply system that looks elegant in peacetime but snaps the moment crisis hits. Both the United States and the United Kingdom now seem to face similar problems to some degree, which suggests this is not an isolated phenomenon but a deeper failure in the Western approach to military governance. More seriously, modern Western military design seems to be drifting further and further away from the realities of war. Wartime management thinking has been replaced by a marketized, financialized, procedural management culture. Military decision-making is supposed to consider worst-case scenarios. It is supposed to prepare backup plans, substitute plans, and redundant systems for emergencies. But in reality, the system has no fault tolerance at all. Once the chain comes under pressure, the whole thing begins to collapse. And when that collapse actually happens, those in charge cannot even produce enough alternatives to fill the gaps. That is why the US military now is not merely unwilling to keep fighting, it is increasingly unable to fight. By contrast, Iran has adopted precisely the opposite model. It relies on systems that are simpler, cheaper, and easier to manufacture and replace. Its weapons may not be more sophisticated, but they are better suited to sustained attritional warfare and easier to iterate quickly. This is a low-cost, sustainable way of waging war, and in a long confrontation, that model may actually hold the advantage. For that very reason, if even a brief ceasefire window appears, Iran may be able to restore a substantial portion of its usable missile stockpile very quickly. So at this point, the balance of power in this war has in fact already changed. The United States knows it will be very difficult to sustain this much longer, and Iran knows it too. Iran also knows that time is on its side. Right now, whether in terms of weapons replenishment speed, industrial model, or systemic resilience, the situation favors Iran more. That is why, in this conflict, the side that truly holds the advantage in strategic endurance may not be the United States. This also explains why Trump really does need a ceasefire. Yes, of course he wants to escape the enormous crisis he helped create. But that is not the only reason. A more immediate and concrete reason is that he has to stop, because stockpiles are already too low and combat capability has been weakened too visibly. For him, peace is now not an ideal choice, but a priority imposed by necessity. When he initially said that this war might last 4 to 6 weeks, I suspect he may actually have known quite well that this was not just a time estimate. It may also have been a hint. The usable weapons at his disposal were probably only enough to sustain operations for about that long. Once those weapons ran low, he would have no choice but to begin seeking a ceasefire and mediation. In other words, it is not the other side that ran out of endurance first. It is the United States that first hit a hard resource ceiling. Going forward, we will likely see a great deal of messaging built around this reality. Negotiations appear to be making progress, deadlines are repeatedly extended, another 2 weeks of talks are needed, more time is required, and so on. But beneath all of these narratives lies one glaring fact. The United States no longer has the conditions necessary to relaunch a full-scale war. And the impact of this goes far beyond the Middle East. A war lasting only a few weeks has already weakened American military power to a very dangerous degree. More importantly, this weakening is not temporary but structural. The missile stockpiles, industrial flexibility, platform lifespan, and critical systems lost today cannot simply be restored tomorrow. Recovery may take years. In other words, the United States' capacity for military intervention on a global scale is visibly declining, and in some directions may already be close to dysfunction. Its hegemony was not shattered by a slogan, it was pierced and exposed by war in the most direct way possible. So, in my view, this conclusion is becoming very hard to avoid. The United States is now unable to restart the war against Iran. Not now, not in the short term, and not before a long process of reconstruction is completed, and that reconstruction is certainly not something that can be achieved in a few months. It will probably take years. Therefore, in any practical sense, this war is effectively already over. At the end of the day, this conflict has exposed a deeply ironic fact. A low-cost, low-tech threshold sustainability-oriented mode of warfare has actually overpowered the high-efficiency, low-resilience military system shaped by neoliberalism. America's problem is not just one mistaken decision, it is a failure of the entire mode of thinking. It is precisely this mindset that has made the world economy more fragile, global politics more rigid, and now has made the world's most powerful military machine look so vulnerable under the pressure of real war. Neoliberalism is not a universal solution, quite the opposite. In more and more fields, it is proving to be a formula for dysfunction and disaster. The United States has now seen the consequences with its own eyes, while Iran is confronting it with a different logic and benefiting from it. That is also why we need to rethink many things that have long been treated as common sense, because the cruelest thing about this war is that it has suddenly exposed all of these problems at once. That is my view. What do you think? Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. If you like this discussion, please share it with more people, and if you'd like, don't forget to subscribe to the channel.